Frank Miller adjusted his police uniform and checked his reflection in the bathroom mirror of the courthouse. His short brown hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes looked alert, despite the late nights he had spent preparing for this case. He straightened his tie and practiced his innocent expression one more time. Today was important. Today, he and his partners would finally put an end to that troublemaker, Dr. Marcus Johnson. Frank left the bathroom and walked down the marble hallway where his partners waited. Detective Greg Hayes leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Sergeant Alan Parker paced back and forth, his heavy footsteps echoing off the walls. "You ready for this?" Greg asked without looking up from his phone. His blonde hair fell over his forehead as he hunched over the screen. "Born ready," Frank replied with a smile. "Johnson doesn't stand a chance." Alan stopped pacing and joined them. He was the oldest of the three, with salt and pepper hair and a permanent frown that had deepened over his 20 years on the force. "Remember, stick to the story. We found the drugs in his car during a routine traffic stop. We had probable cause because he was swerving." Frank nodded. The three of them had been working together in the Westridge Police Department for 7 years. They controlled their district with fear and false charges when needed. People learned not to challenge them. Dr. Marcus Johnson had not learned this lesson yet. "Here comes the man of the hour," Greg whispered as Dr. Johnson walked up the hallway with his lawyer. Dr. Johnson was tall, with dark skin and intelligent eyes that had not lost their confidence despite the charges against him. He wore a simple gray suit and carried a briefcase full of evidence that Frank knew would never see the light of day. Not with Judge Wilson presiding, the same Judge Wilson who played golf with Detective Hayes every Sunday. Dr. Johnson glanced at the three officers as he passed. For a moment his eyes met Frank's, and Frank felt a strange chill. There was something in that look, something that made Frank uneasy, but he pushed the feeling aside. Nothing could go wrong today. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Wilson," the bailiff called out as they entered the courtroom. Judge Wilson, a heavy-set man with thinning white hair, nodded to Greg before taking his seat. Frank hid his smile. This would be even easier than they thought. The prosecutor, a young woman named Laura Fisher, presented the case. "Your Honor, Officers Miller, Hayes, and Parker conducted a traffic stop on April 15th. The defendant, Dr. Marcus Johnson, was observed driving erratically. During the stop, officers discovered 50 grams of cocaine hidden under the driver's seat." Frank kept his face serious as he remembered how they had planted those drugs after breaking into Dr. Johnson's car the night before. It had been Alan's idea after Dr. Johnson filed complaints about police harassment in his neighborhood. Teaching him a lesson, Alan had called it. Dr. Johnson's lawyer, a sharp-looking man named Paul Green, stood up. "Your Honor, my client is an aerospace engineer with a spotless record. We have evidence that the officers in question have repeatedly targeted Dr. Johnson after he organized a community meeting about police practices in predominantly black neighborhoods." Judge Wilson waved his hand dismissively. "Present your evidence, counselor." As Paul Green spoke, he showed dashboard camera footage that had captured Frank and his partners discussing their plan near Dr. Johnson's car the night before the supposed traffic stop. Frank felt sweat forming on his brow. How had Johnson gotten that footage? "Furthermore," Green continued, "we have testimony from witnesses who saw these officers near Dr. Johnson's car while it was parked at his home, hours before the alleged traffic stop." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Frank exchanged worried glances with Greg and Alan. This wasn't supposed to happen. Judge Wilson called both lawyers to the bench. After a brief, heated discussion, he turned to the courtroom. "There appears to be a technical issue with the evidence presented by the defense," Judge Wilson announced. "The chain of custody for the video footage cannot be verified, and therefore it is inadmissible." Frank almost laughed out loud. Chain of custody? The footage clearly showed them planting evidence. But he kept his face neutral as relief washed over him. "Additionally," the judge continued, "the witness statements were not properly submitted during discovery and will be stricken from the record." Dr. Johnson closed his eyes briefly, his face showing the pain of injustice. His lawyer argued desperately, but Judge Wilson had made his decision. "Due to these procedural issues and lack of admissible evidence to counter the officer's testimony, I have no choice but to dismiss the charges against the officers for misconduct." The case against Dr. Johnson will proceed to trial next month. The gavel came down with a final thud that echoed through the courtroom. Frank looked at Dr. Johnson, expecting to see defeat on his face. Instead, Johnson was looking directly at him with an expression Frank couldn't read. It wasn't anger or fear. It looked almost like patience. As the courtroom emptied, Frank, Greg, and Alan gathered their things, trying to contain their excitement. Justice served, Alan whispered to Frank with a smirk as they walked out. Frank laughed. Another day, another win for the good guys. Greg checked his watch. First round's on me, let's celebrate at Eddie's bar. As they walked down the courthouse steps into the bright spring day, Frank noticed Dr. Johnson standing by a black car, speaking on his phone. Johnson looked up as they passed, and again Frank felt that strange uneasiness. Something about the man's calm demeanor didn't fit with someone who had just lost everything. What are you looking at? Alan snapped at Johnson as they walked by. Dr. Johnson smiled slightly. The future, Officer Parker. Just the future. Frank hurried Alan along before he could start anything. Leave it. He's not worth it. We won, remember? That night at Eddie's bar, the three officers drank and laughed, telling stories of other criminals they had put away. Frank tried to join in the celebration, but he couldn't shake the memory of Dr. Johnson's confident smile. It was as if Johnson knew something they didn't. Earth to Frank, Greg said, waving a hand in front of his face. You still with us? Frank forced a smile. Yeah, just thinking about what a good day it's been. Alan raised his glass. To us, the finest officers Westridge has ever seen. Frank raised his glass too, but as he drank, he couldn't help wondering if their luck would hold. Something told him that Dr. Marcus Johnson wasn't done with them yet, not by a long shot. Little did Frank know that in 2 weeks everything would change. Their world would be turned upside down by the very man they thought they had defeated. But for now they celebrated, unaware that their days of corruption were numbered. 2 weeks passed since the courtroom victory. Frank Miller sat at his desk in the Westridge Police Department, filling out paperwork for a traffic violation. The memory of their win against Dr. Marcus Johnson had started to fade into the background of daily routine. Life at the precinct continued as usual. The intercom on Frank's desk buzzed. All officers report to the main briefing room at 1100 hours, announced the voice of Linda, the front desk secretary. Chief Roberts has an important announcement. Frank checked his watch, 10:45 a.m. He grabbed his coffee mug and walked over to Greg's desk. Any idea what this is about? Greg shrugged. Probably another budget cut or some new paperwork we need to fill out. I heard the chief is retiring, said Alan, joining them with a half-eaten donut in his hand. My buddy in administration said they're bringing in someone new to run the precinct. Frank frowned. New boss means new rules. I hope it's not someone who wants to shake things up. Don't worry, Alan said, patting Frank's shoulder. Whoever it is, they'll learn how things work around here soon enough. He laughed and crumbs fell from his mouth onto his shirt. The three officers made their way to the briefing room. Most of the other cops were already there, sitting in rows of plastic chairs facing the podium at the front. Frank, Greg, and Alan took seats in the back row. I bet $5 it's that guy from the downtown precinct, Captain Thompson, whispered Greg. Alan shook his head. No way. My money's on Lieutenant Davis from Internal Affairs. Whoever it is, Frank said. We'll need to feel them out, see if they play ball our way. Chief Roberts walked in, his round face red from the short walk from his office. He was in his 60s with a large belly that hung over his belt and thinning gray hair. After 30 years on the force, he looked ready for retirement. Attention. Everyone, Chief Roberts called out, and the room fell quiet. As some of you may have heard, I am retiring at the end of this month. These old bones can't keep up with the job anymore. He patted his knee with a small smile. But before I go, I want to introduce you to the person who will be taking over as commander of this precinct. Frank leaned forward in his chair. Greg nudged him and whispered, $10 says it's a paper pusher who's never seen real action. Chief Roberts continued, Your new commander comes with an impressive background. West Point graduate, 5 years, with internal affairs and special training with the FBI. Please welcome Commander Marcus Johnson." Frank's blood turned cold. Greg's mouth fell open. Alan dropped the rest of his donut on the floor. The side door opened and Dr. Marcus Johnson walked in. But he wasn't wearing his usual suit. Instead, he wore the uniform of a police commander, complete with badges and insignia that marked him as their new boss. His shoes were polished to a shine, and his face showed no emotion as he took his place next to Chief Roberts. "No way," Greg whispered. "This has to be a joke." Frank couldn't speak. He watched in horror as the man they had framed 2 weeks ago scanned the room, his eyes eventually finding the 3 officers in the back row. "Good morning, officers," Commander Johnson said, his voice firm and clear. "Some of you may recognize me from previous encounters." His eyes stayed on Frank for a moment longer than comfortable. "For those who don't, I am Commander Marcus Johnson, your new commanding officer effective immediately." Frank felt like the room was spinning. This couldn't be happening. The man they had planted drugs on, the man whose life they had tried to ruin, was now their boss. "I'd like to share a little about my background," Commander Johnson continued. "For the past 5 years I've been working undercover for internal affairs, investigating police corruption across 3 states. My assignment in Westridge is my first public position since completing that operation." The room was completely silent. No one moved, no one whispered. Every officer seemed to be thinking the same thing. Had Johnson been investigating them? "During my time undercover, I've seen the best and worst of police work. I've witnessed officers who serve with honor and integrity, and I've seen those who abuse their power." Johnson's eyes swept across the room again, lingering on the back row. "I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability. Starting today, this precinct will operate with complete transparency and by the book." Frank felt Greg grip his arm tightly. Alan had gone pale, his face almost the same color as his white shirt. "Chief Roberts will remain for the next 2 weeks to help with the transition," Johnson said. "During this time, I will be reviewing all active cases and personnel files. I look forward to working with each of you to serve and protect our community properly." As the briefing ended, officers filed out of the room. Some approached Commander Johnson to introduce themselves. Others hurried back to their desks, suddenly concerned about paperwork they had neglected. Frank, Greg, and Alan remained, frozen in their seats until the room had nearly emptied. "We're dead," Greg whispered. "He's going to fire us all." "Worse," Alan said. "He could press charges. We planted evidence. That's a felony." Frank stood up slowly. "Let's not panic. He hasn't done anything yet. Maybe he doesn't have proof of what we did." As they finally moved to leave, Commander Johnson called out, "Officers Miller, Hayes, and Parker, a moment, please." The 3 exchanged nervous glances before approaching their new boss. Up close, Johnson looked even more intimidating in his commander's uniform. "I believe we have some unfinished business," Johnson said quietly so only they could hear. "Sir?" Frank began, trying to keep his voice steady. "About what happened?" Johnson held up his hand. "Not here. My office, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. We'll discuss your future with this department then." He looked at each of them in turn. "I suggest you spend the evening thinking about your careers and what kind of officers you want to be moving forward." With that, he walked away, leaving the 3 men staring after him. Back at their desks, Greg looked like he might be sick. "We should quit now. Get out before he builds a case against us." "And go where?" Alan snapped. "What department would hire us with a resignation during an internal investigation?" Frank sat down heavily in his chair. "We don't know what he wants. Yet maybe he's giving us a chance." "A chance?" Alan laughed bitterly. "We tried to send him to prison, Frank. Would you give us a chance if you were him?" Frank had no answer. He remembered Commander Johnson's words from the courthouse steps. The future, Officer Parker. Just the future. Now, it made sense. Johnson had known even then that their positions would soon be reversed. As the day ended, Frank drove home in silence. His mind raced with worries about what tomorrow would bring. Would they be fired, arrested, or was Commander Johnson planning something else entirely? Whatever happened, Frank knew one thing for certain. Their lives as corrupt cops were over. The only question was what would replace them. Frank arrived at the station at 7:30 a.m., half an hour before his scheduled meeting with Commander Johnson. He hadn't slept well. Dark circles lined his eyes, and his uniform felt tight around his neck. He found Greg already waiting by the coffee machine, looking just as tired. "Did you sleep?" Frank asked, reaching for a paper cup. Greg shook his head. "Not a wink." "You?" "Maybe an hour." Frank poured himself coffee, adding 2 extra sugars. He would need the energy. "Where's Alan?" "Haven't seen him yet." Greg checked his watch. He better hurry. It's almost 7:45. They sipped their coffee in silence. Other officers arrived for the morning shift, some nodding to Frank and Greg, others keeping their distance. Word had spread quickly about their connection to Commander Johnson's court case. Nobody wanted to be associated with potential trouble. At 7:55, Alan rushed through the door, his tie crooked and his shirt half untucked. "Cutting it close," Frank said as Alan joined them. "I almost didn't come in at all," Alan admitted, straightening his tie with shaking hands. "What's the point? We're finished." "We don't know that yet," Frank replied, though he didn't believe his own words. At exactly 8:00, they knocked on Commander Johnson's office door. The nameplate already showed his new title, the paint still fresh. "Enter," called Johnson's voice from inside. They walked in to find Commander Johnson sitting behind his desk reviewing papers. The office had changed since Chief Roberts' time. The fishing trophies and old sports photos were gone, replaced by diplomas, certificates, and a large map of Westridge marked with colored pins. "Officers," Johnson said without looking up. "Have a seat." The 3 men sat in the chairs facing his desk. Frank noticed a folder with his name on it sitting in front of Johnson. Similar folders for Greg and Alan were stacked beside it. "I've spent the night reviewing your service records," Johnson said, finally looking up at them. "Interesting reading." None of the officers spoke. What could they say? "Officer Miller," Johnson opened Frank's folder. 7 years with the department, 26 commendations, 43 complaints from civilians, all dismissed. He looked at Frank with a raised eyebrow. "That's quite a high number of complaints to all be without merit, wouldn't you say?" Frank swallowed hard, but remained silent. "Detective Hayes," Johnson continued, opening the next folder. 9 years of service, transferred here from Boston after, what was it? Ah, yes, allegations of evidence tampering that were dropped when the witness recanted. Johnson looked at Greg. The witness recanted after being arrested for an unrelated charge that was later dismissed. Quite a coincidence. Greg stared at his hands in his lap. "And Sergeant Parker." Johnson opened the final folder. 15 years here. The most complaints of any officer in the precinct's history. 67 in total, predominantly from residents in the East Side neighborhoods. Johnson closed the folder with a snap. Predominantly black neighborhoods. Alan's face flushed red, but he kept his eyes on the floor. Commander Johnson leaned back in his chair. "Gentlemen, I could fire you all right now. I have enough to open investigations that would not only end your careers, but possibly send you to prison." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "But I'm not going to do that." Frank's head snapped up in surprise. Greg and Alan looked equally shocked. "At least not yet," Johnson added. "I believe in second chances. Everyone deserves an opportunity to change, to make better choices." He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the precinct parking lot. "Starting today, things will be different in this department. New body camera protocols, new community outreach programs, new disciplinary procedures." He turned back to face them. "And you 3 will be my test cases." "What does that mean, sir?" Frank asked, finally finding his voice. "It means I'm giving you a chance to be the officers you should have been all along." Johnson returned to his desk and handed each of them a new assignment sheet. "Officer Miller, you'll be working community patrol in the East Side, getting to know the residents you've been terrorizing." Frank took the paper with a trembling hand. "Detective Hayes, you're being reassigned to cold cases. There are victims who deserve justice that's been denied to them. Johnson handed Greg his assignment. And Sergeant Parker, you'll be leading our new youth outreach program at the community center. Alan looked up in disbelief. You want me to work with kids? I want you to see the community as people, not targets, Johnson replied firmly. These assignments aren't punishments. They're opportunities for you to reconnect with why you became police officers in the first place. He sat back down at his desk. You'll each have a partner who reports directly to me. Any complaints, any step out of line, and your second chance is over. Is that clear? The three men nodded silently. One more thing, Johnson added. The case against me has been reopened based on new evidence. Judge Wilson has recused himself after evidence of his connection to Detective Hayes came to light. He looked directly at Greg. I suggest you find a new golf partner, Detective. As they left the office, Frank felt like he was walking in a dream. How had everything changed so quickly? In the hallway, Alan grabbed Frank's arm. This is garbage. He's setting us up to fail. We should fight back. And do what? Greg asked. We're lucky we're not in handcuffs right now. Frank thought about Johnson's words. A second chance. Did they deserve one after what they'd done? Over. The next few weeks, the changes Commander Johnson promised swept through the department. New body cameras appeared on every uniform. Community meetings were scheduled weekly. Training sessions on bias and proper procedure became mandatory. Most officers adapted quickly, some even expressing relief at the new direction. But Frank, Greg, and Alan struggled with their new assignments. Frank walked the beat in the east side, facing suspicious glares from residents who remembered his previous behavior. Each day was a lesson in humility as he tried to rebuild trust he had broken long ago. Greg sat in the cold case room, surrounded by files of forgotten victims. The faces in the photos haunted him as he realized how many people had never received justice while he had been busy protecting himself and his friends. Alan had the hardest time. The children at the community center treated him with a mixture of fear and defiance. His short temper flared often, but each time he thought about losing his job and possibly his freedom, he forced himself to stay calm. After a month, Frank was surprised to find himself actually caring about his new beat. He learned names, listened to concerns, and for the first time in years, felt like he was doing real police work. One evening as his shift ended, he saw Commander Johnson watching him from across the street. Frank approached him, standing straighter than he had in weeks. Officer Miller, Johnson nodded. How are you finding your new assignment? Frank hesitated before answering honestly. Hard, sir, but necessary. Johnson studied his face. Do you know why I didn't fire you that first day? No, sir, I don't, Frank admitted. Because revenge is easy, transformation is hard. Johnson gestured to the neighborhood around them. These people don't need more enemies. They need officers who protect them, who see them as worthy of respect and safety. As Johnson walked away, Frank realized something had changed within him. The anger and fear he had felt toward his new boss had been replaced by something unexpected. Respect, but not everyone felt the same way. Later that night, Alan called Frank with a dangerous idea. We need to talk, he said. I think I found a way to get rid of our problem. Frank met Alan at a small diner far from the police station. It was nearly midnight and the place was almost empty except for a tired waitress and a cook visible through the kitchen window. Greg arrived 5 minutes later, sliding into the booth, beside Alan. This better be important, Greg said, looking around nervously. I have to be at the station early tomorrow to review cold cases. Alan leaned forward, his voice low. I've been watching Johnson for weeks. I think I found a way to get him out of our hair for good. Frank stirred his coffee slowly. What are you talking about? A plan to frame him, Alan said, his eyes bright with excitement. Just like old times. Frank and Greg exchanged uncomfortable glances. Hear me out, Alan continued. Johnson's been pushing all these new programs, right? Community outreach, special training, new equipment, it's all expensive. So? Greg asked. So I've been looking into the department budget, Alan explained. There's money coming in from a federal grant for these programs. What if some of that money went missing? And what if evidence of that missing money was found in Johnson's personal files? Frank put down his coffee cup. You want to steal money and frame Johnson for it? Not real money, Alan said quickly. Just make it look like money is missing. Create some fake records, plant them in Johnson's office, then make an anonymous tip to Internal Affairs. That's crazy, Greg whispered. If we get caught, we won't, Alan insisted. I've thought it all through. It's simple. We make it look like Johnson's been skimming from the grant funds. IA will have to investigate. Even if they don't find enough to charge him, his reputation will be ruined. He'll be removed during the investigation and we can get back to normal. Frank stared at Alan. Normal? You mean back to planting evidence and harassing people? Alan's face hardened. Don't tell me you're enjoying being Johnson's puppet. Walking. That beat in the East Side taking abuse from those people. Those people, Frank repeated slowly, have names, they have families, they have rights. Since when do you care? Alan sneered. Greg looked back and forth between them. Keep it down. Someone will hear you. Frank pushed his coffee away. I'm not doing it. What? Alan's voice rose. I said no, Frank stated firmly. We've been given a second chance. I'm not throwing that away. Alan laughed bitterly. A second chance? He's humiliating us, making examples of us. You think this is about reform? It's about revenge. Frank shook his head. If Johnson wanted revenge, we'd be in jail right now. He's trying to make us better cops. Listen to yourself, Alan said with disgust. You sound like you've joined his fan club. Greg cleared his throat. I'm with Frank on this one. I can't risk it. Those cold cases. Some of them should have been solved years ago. Kids who never got justice because we were too busy protecting ourselves. Alan looked at Greg in disbelief. He's got you brainwashed too. It's not brainwashing to realize we were wrong, Greg replied quietly. Alan stood up suddenly, his face flushed with anger. Fine. Be his little reform puppets. I'll handle this myself. He threw some money on the table and stormed out of the diner. Frank and Greg sat in silence for a moment. You think he'll really try something? Greg finally asked. Frank nodded slowly. You know, Alan. Once he gets an idea in his head, what should we do? Frank stared at the door where Alan had exited. I don't know. The next day, Frank walked his beat in the East Side neighborhood. He greeted Mrs. Washington on her porch and helped Mr. Rivera carry groceries to his apartment. Small things, but each interaction felt like mending a tiny piece of the trust that had been broken. As he passed the community center, he saw Alan inside, watching the children play basketball. Alan's face was a mask of boredom and resentment. One boy missed a shot and the ball rolled toward Alan. Instead of returning it, Alan kicked it away and checked his watch. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Alan's plan and what it would mean. Eventually, he got up and drove to a small house on the outskirts of town. Frank sat in his car outside Commander Johnson's home for nearly an hour. Lights were on inside, and through the window he could see Johnson in what looked like a home office, working late. As Frank watched, the front door opened, and several neighborhood children appeared. Johnson came out and joined them in a game of basketball on a small court in the driveway. He showed them how to shoot properly, patiently correcting their form and cheering when they made baskets. Frank listened to their laughter floating through the night air. He remembered why he had become a police officer in the first place, to help people, to make a difference. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. His phone buzzed with a text from Alan. Plan in motion. 48 hours. Frank's heart sank. Alan was going through with it. He had to make a decision. The next morning, Frank arrived at the station early. He was surprised to find Greg already there, pacing outside Commander Johnson's office. You got a text, too? Frank asked. Greg nodded. He's crazy. This could ruin all of us. We have to tell Johnson, Frank said. Greg looked uncertain. You sure? Alan will never forgive us. I can live with that, Frank replied. I'm not sure I can live with going back to who we were before. They knocked on Johnson's door. When they entered, they found him reviewing reports with his usual focused expression. Officers, Johnson said, looking up. What can I do for you? Frank took a deep breath. "We need to talk to you about Sergeant Parker, sir." Johnson sat down, his papers. "Go on." "He's planning to frame you," Greg blurted out. "He wants to create fake evidence that you've been stealing from the federal grant money and then tip off internal affairs." Johnson's expression remained calm. "I see. And why are you telling me this?" Frank stepped forward. "Because it's wrong, sir. And because—" He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Because you were right about second chances. About being the officers we should have been all along." Johnson studied them both for a long moment. "Do you have proof of this?"
Plan?
Greg showed him the text from Alan. Johnson read it silently. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," Johnson said finally. "I'll handle it from here." "What will happen to Alan?" Frank asked. "That depends on his actions," Johnson replied. "But I appreciate your honesty. It couldn't have been an easy choice." As they left the office, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he had made the right choice simply because it was right, not because it benefited him. Greg looked at him as they walked down the hallway. "You think we did the right thing?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, I do." "Alan's going to hate us," Greg said. "Maybe," Frank agreed. "But I couldn't let him do it. Not just for Johnson's sake, but for Alan's too. And ours." Later that day, as Frank finished his patrol, he saw Alan being escorted into the station by 2 internal affairs officers. Their eyes met briefly as Alan passed. In that moment, Frank saw not anger in Alan's eyes, but fear, the fear of a man who had made the wrong choice and knew it was too late to take it back. 6 months had passed since Alan's arrest. The West Ridge Police Department had transformed under Commander Johnson's leadership. Crime rates were down. Civilian complaints had dropped by 70%. Officer morale was at an all-time high. Frank stood in front of the mirror in the station locker room, adjusting his uniform. The face that looked back at him seemed different now, less hard, more at peace. He no longer dreaded going to work each day. Instead, he found himself looking forward to his beat in the East Side neighborhood. Greg walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Frank. "Ready for the ceremony?" Frank nodded, taking a sip. "Hard to believe it's been 6 months already." "Hard to believe how much has changed," Greg added. They walked together to the community center where a crowd had gathered for the opening of the new police outreach office. Residents chatted with officers, children played games with cadets, and local business owners served food from booths set up around the room. Commander Johnson stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. When he saw Frank and Greg, he waved them over. "Officers," Johnson said with a genuine smile, "today wouldn't be possible without your help." Frank felt a flush of pride. After they had reported Alan's plan, Johnson had asked them to help design the new community outreach program. The past months had been filled with meetings, planning sessions, and countless hours of work to rebuild trust between the police and the community. "Any word on Alan?" Greg asked quietly. Johnson's expression turned serious. "He took a plea deal last week. 2 years probation, and he surrendered his badge." Frank nodded silently. Alan had been caught red-handed trying to plant false evidence in Johnson's office. The security cameras Johnson had installed throughout the station had captured everything. In the end, Alan's plan had backfired completely. "He could have faced jail time," Johnson continued, "but I spoke to the prosecutor. I believe people deserve second chances even when they reject the first one." A local news crew arrived, setting up cameras near a small stage. Johnson excused himself to prepare for his speech. Frank and Greg found places at the back of the room. Mrs. Washington, an elderly resident from Frank's beat, spotted him and came over. "Officer Miller," she said warmly. "My grandson got that scholarship to the police academy, the one you told him about." Frank smiled. "That's great news, Mrs. Washington. He'll make a fine officer. He might not have applied if you hadn't encouraged him," she said, patting his arm before returning to her family. Greg raised an eyebrow. Look at you, recruiting the next generation. Frank shrugged, but he couldn't hide his smile. 6 months. Ago, the idea of anyone from the East Side wanting to become a police officer would have seemed impossible. Now things were different. The ceremony began with Commander Johnson taking the stage. As he spoke about partnership between police and community, Frank reflected on how far they had come. After the official ribbon cutting, people mingled and enjoyed the celebration. Frank was talking with some local kids when he noticed a familiar figure watching from the doorway. Alan Parker stood there, looking thinner and older than Frank remembered. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, Frank thought Alan might leave, but instead, he walked over. "Quite a show," Alan said, his voice lacking its usual edge. Frank nodded cautiously. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," Alan admitted. He looked around at the crowded room. "So this is the new Westridge PD, huh?" Is," Frank replied. "It's working, Alan. Crime is down. People trust us again." Alan was quiet for a moment. "I saw Johnson speak on TV last week about police reform. The department is being used as a model for other cities." He shook his head. "Hard to believe we almost ruined it all." "You could have been part of it," Frank said quietly. "I know." Alan looked down at his hands, no longer adorned with a badge or service weapon. Pride is a hard thing to swallow. Before Frank could respond, Commander Johnson approached them. "Mr. Parker," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Alan seemed surprised by the gesture but shook Johnson's hand. "I'm starting a program for former officers," Johnson explained. "Helping them find new careers, ways to serve the community without a badge. If you're interested, there's a place for you." Alan stared at Johnson in disbelief. "Why would you help me after what I tried to do?" "Because change doesn't happen by shutting people out," Johnson replied. "It happens by giving them a path forward." He handed Alan a business card. "Think about it." After Johnson walked away, Alan looked at the card in his hand. "He never gives up, does he?" "That's why he's in charge," Frank said with a small smile. Greg joined them, clearly surprised to see Alan. "Parker, didn't expect to see you here." "Just passing through," Alan replied. He pocketed Johnson's card. "Good to see you both." With a nod, he turned and left the community center. Greg watched him go. "You think he'll take Johnson up on his offer?" "I don't know," Frank said, "but at least he has the choice." As the day wound down, Frank helped clean up the community center. Commander Johnson found him stacking chairs in the corner. "Officer Miller," Johnson said, "I have something for you." He handed Frank an envelope. Frank opened it to find promotion papers. "Sergeant?" Johnson nodded. "You've earned it. I need officers like you in leadership positions if we want these changes to last." Frank stared at the papers. "I'm not sure I deserve this." 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you," Johnson said. "But people can change when given the opportunity. You and Hayes proved that. And Parker proved the opposite," Frank added. "Parker chose his path," Johnson replied, "just as you chose yours. That's what matters in the end, not where we start, but the choices we make along the way." Later that evening, Frank drove through the East Side neighborhood. Children played in yards that had once been empty out of fear. Elderly residents sat on porches that had once been abandoned after dark. Store owners kept their shops open late, without worry. He parked his car and walked to a small playground where a group of teens were shooting hoops. They waved when they saw him, no longer running or hiding at the sight of a police uniform. "Officer Miller," one called out. "Want to play?" Frank joined their game, laughing as they teased him about his poor shooting skills. As the sun set over Westridge, he thought about the journey of the past 6 months, from corrupt cop to community leader, from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution. When the game ended, Frank sat on a bench, watching the last light fade from the sky. His phone buzzed with a text from Greg. "Just saw Alan at the meeting for Johnson's new program." Frank smiled. Perhaps second chances really did work, even for the most reluctant. He looked up at the stars appearing overhead and felt something, he hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future and pride in the present. Commander Johnson had transformed not just the department, but the officers within it. He had shown them that true justice wasn't about power or control. It was about service, respect, and the courage to change. In giving them a second chance, he had given the whole community a fresh start. Frank stood up and headed back to his car. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face them. Not as the corrupt cop he had been, but as the officer he was always meant to be.